The snow had been falling for 6 days straight. Not the gentle, picturesque snow of Christmas cards, but the relentless, suffocating snow of the high Rockies in January. 3 feet had already accumulated, then 4, then 5. By the 7th day, the snow reached 8 feet deep across the valley floor. Most cabins in the region were barely visible, just dark shapes beneath white mounds. But one cabin had disappeared entirely. Completely buried under 12 feet of packed snow, the structure showed no sign of existence. No chimney poked through. No windows caught the weak winter light. A traveler passing by would have walked right over it, never knowing a man lived beneath his feet. Yet inside that buried cabin, Jacob Whitmore was warm. Not just surviving, but genuinely comfortable at a temperature where exposed skin freezes in minutes. While the outside world measured -49 degrees Fahrenheit, Jacob sat in his underground sanctuary at a steady 55 degrees, reading a book by lamplight. This was January 1876, and Jacob Whitmore was in his 23rd winter in this cabin. He'd built it himself in 1853, and he would live in it for 20 more winters after this one. A total of 43 years in a structure that spent half of every year buried under snow. He was 71 years old, living alone at 10,000 feet elevation in the Colorado Rockies, and he'd mastered something that modern survival experts with all their technology struggle to achieve. He'd created a home that worked with winter instead of fighting it. The story of how he built it, how he survived in it, and what he understood about extreme cold living is a masterclass in adaptation. It's about a man who looked at the harshest environment in North America and asked not how to conquer it, but how to live within it. Jacob Whitmore wasn't born in the mountains. He came from Pennsylvania, the son of a carpenter and a schoolteacher. Born in 1805, he'd learned his father's trade by age 12, working on houses, barns, and mills throughout the Delaware Valley. He was good at it, good enough to run his own crew by age 25. He married at 27, had 2 children, and seemed destined for a prosperous, ordinary life. Then his wife died in 1838. Cholera swept through their town, taking her and their youngest child in the same week. Jacob buried them on a Tuesday, worked through Wednesday and Thursday because he didn't know what else to do, and by Friday, he'd made his decision. He was going west. He sold his business, left his surviving daughter with his wife's sister, and joined a fur trading expedition heading for the Rocky Mountains. It was 1839. He was 34 years old, and he never returned to Pennsylvania. The first 15 years in the mountains taught Jacob what textbooks never could. He learned by watching, by making mistakes, and by surviving the consequences. He trapped beaver with French Canadians who taught him which furs were worth taking and which weren't worth the effort. He wintered with Ute people who showed him how to read weather patterns and predict storms days before they arrived. He survived 2 different winters that killed other trappers, learning from their mistakes as much as from their successes. By 1853, the fur trade was dying. Beaver were trapped out, silk had replaced fur in hat making, and most mountain men were moving on. But Jacob had fallen in love with the high country. He'd found a valley at 10,000 feet elevation, sheltered on 3 sides by peaks that reached 14,000 feet. A cold spring ran year-round. Timber was abundant, game was plentiful, and most importantly, it was isolated enough that he could claim it as his own. He decided to build not just a cabin, but a home, a place where he could live year-round, alone, at an elevation where winter lasted 8 months and summer barely lasted 2. He was 48 years old, and he was about to build something remarkable. Most mountain cabins were built above ground for good reason. Digging in rocky, frozen soil was brutal work. Building underground meant dealing with moisture, potential collapse, and suffocation if ventilation failed. Every practical consideration suggested building a standard log cabin and calling it done. Jacob did the opposite. He'd spent enough winters in above-ground cabins to understand their fatal flaws. They fought the wind and usually lost. They required constant fires to stay barely warm. They turned into ice boxes the moment the fire died, and worst of all, they were psychological traps. Dark, cramped spaces that made winter isolation even more oppressive. Jacob wanted something different. He wanted a structure that would use the earth itself as insulation, that would maintain stable temperatures with minimal heating, and that would feel spacious even when buried under snow. He started by selecting his exact building site. Not just a good general area, but the specific spot where his cabin would sit. He spent 2 weeks studying his valley, watching how snow accumulated, noting where drifts formed and where wind scoured the ground bare. He observed where morning sun hit first and where evening shadows fell. He checked for underground water by digging test holes. He examined soil composition to ensure it would drain properly. Finally, he chose a south-facing slope, 20 degrees of incline, sheltered from northwest winds by a rock outcropping but open to southern sun. The location was perfect for what he planned. In May of 1853, Jacob began digging, not a shallow foundation, but a real excavation. He was building down into the earth, cutting a chamber 16 feet wide, 20 feet deep, and 8 feet high into the hillside. This wasn't a job for one man, but Jacob worked alone. He'd always worked alone. The digging took 3 months. 3 months of swinging a pick, shoveling dirt, hauling rocks, cutting roots, and slowly creating a cavity in the mountain. He dug in sections, shoring up walls as he went with timber frames. The back wall went deepest into the hillside, 12 feet into solid earth. The side walls angled slightly, 8 feet into the slope on each side. The front wall would be mostly above ground, the face of the structure. By August, the excavation was complete. Now came the actual construction. The back and side walls, already dug into the earth, were lined with dry stacked stone, not mortared, which could crack from freeze-thaw cycles, but carefully fitted stones that would shift slightly without collapsing. Behind these stone walls, he packed a 2-foot layer of loose rock and gravel. This drainage layer would channel any moisture downward, preventing it from seeping into the cabin. It was a principle he'd learned from an old German trapper who'd built root cellars using the same method. The front wall was the crucial element. This would be the only wall exposed to the elements, and it needed to be both strong and insulated. Jacob built it thick, 3 feet thick. The outer layer was made from 18-inch diameter logs, carefully notched and fitted. These logs were debarked and seasoned, selected for straightness and lack of rot. Behind the log wall, he built an inner wall of smaller logs, 8 inches in diameter. Between the 2 walls, he packed 18 inches of crushed bark, dry moss, and sawdust. This 2-wall construction with trapped insulation created a thermal barrier that would prove crucial. The front wall had 3 openings. A door, small and thick, built from 3 layers of wood with hides stretched between the layers for additional insulation. 1 window, 18 inches square, positioned to catch maximum southern sun. The window had no glass. Instead, Jacob created a triple-layer shutter system. An outer shutter of solid wood for storm protection, a middle shutter with a scraped hide window that let in light while blocking wind, and an inner shutter of wood for nighttime insulation. And most importantly, a small ventilation shaft. This shaft, only 6 inches in diameter, angled upward through the front wall and extended 3 feet above the roofline. It would draw fresh air in while expelling stale air, preventing suffocation when the cabin was buried in snow. The ventilation shaft had a crucial feature: a baffle system made from sheet copper that Jacob had traded for. The baffle prevented wind from blowing down the shaft while allowing air to move freely. It also prevented snow from entering. This single feature would save his life multiple times over the coming decades. The roof was where Jacob's design became truly innovative. He didn't build a peaked roof like most cabins. Instead, he created a gently sloped roof that blended into the hillside. The slope ran from front to back, 8 feet high at the front down to 6 feet at the back. This created a ramp effect. Snow would accumulate on top, But instead of creating a peaked load that could collapse the structure, it would spread evenly across the slope and blend into the hillside behind. The roof structure itself was overbuilt to an extreme degree. Primary beams were 12 inches in diameter, placed every 2 feet. Cross beams were 8 inches, laid perpendicular to the primary beams and also spaced every 2 feet. Over this framework, he laid a deck of 6-inch logs, fitted tightly together. Over the log deck, he spread a 6-inch layer of clay mixed with grass for waterproofing. Over the clay, he placed 2 feet of packed sod, grass, and soil. Over that, another layer of bark and branches. The total roof thickness was 3 feet of layered material. The weight was enormous. The structure would support tons of snow without sagging. More importantly, the layered roof would insulate so effectively that Jacob's body heat alone could warm the space. By October of 1853, the basic structure was complete. But Jacob wasn't done. He'd built the shell. Now he needed the systems that would make it livable. Inside the cabin, Jacob created zones. The sleeping area was at the back, against the deepest wall that was buried most thoroughly in the hillside. This area stayed the most stable in temperature because it was buffered by the most earth. He built a sleeping platform 18 inches off the floor. Not just a bed, but a raised platform that would keep him away from the coldest air, which settled at floor level. The platform was filled with dried grass, then covered with multiple hides. His sleeping setup would eventually include a buffalo robe, 3 wool blankets, and a bear hide. Total weight, nearly 60 pounds of insulation. The living area occupied the center of the space. Here, Jacob built his most important feature, a masonry heater. He'd seen these used by European trappers and understood their principle. Unlike a standard fireplace that radiated heat while the fire burned but provided nothing once it died, a masonry heater stored heat in its massive stone structure and released it slowly over many hours. Jacob's masonry heater was built from river stones, mortared with clay mixed with sand and grass. The firebox was relatively small, designed for hot, fast fires rather than long, slow burns. But surrounding the firebox was 8 tons of stone. The stone absorbed heat during the burn, then radiated it for 12 to 16 hours afterward. The chimney ran not straight up, but in a serpentine path through the stone mass, extracting every possible bit of heat from the smoke before venting it outside. The chimney exit was built to extend above the anticipated snow line, even in the deepest winters. Jacob calculated that snow might reach 12 feet deep. His chimney extended 15 feet above the roof. The work area occupied the front of the cabin, near the door and window. Here, Jacob built a workbench, storage shelves, and hooks for tools and clothing. He dug a small root cellar within the cabin, a pit 3 feet deep and 4 feet square, lined with stone. This pit, covered with a wooden lid, would stay just above freezing even in the deepest winter, perfect for storing root vegetables and keeping meat from freezing solid. The floor of the cabin was carefully engineered. Jacob didn't leave it as bare earth. He laid a foundation of fist-sized rocks, 8 inches deep. This drainage layer would channel any moisture that somehow entered the cabin toward the front, where it could drain outside. Over this rock layer, he placed flat stones, fitted as tightly as his skill allowed. Over the stones, he spread sand to fill the gaps. Over the sand, he laid split logs, flat side up, fitted tightly. The result was a floor that was solid, relatively flat, and crucially, insulated from the ground below. Cold air and moisture couldn't rise through multiple layers of rock, sand, and wood. By November of 1853, Jacob moved in. Winter arrived 2 weeks later. That first winter tested everything. The temperature outside dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit multiple times. Snow began in early November and didn't stop until April. By January, the cabin was buried under 10 feet of snow. Jacob discovered that his ventilation system worked better than he'd hoped. The shaft drew in fresh air constantly, even when packed with snow. The copper-baffle prevented backdrafts. Inside air stayed fresh and breathable. He learned that his masonry heater was a game changer. One hot fire in the evening, burning for 2 hours, kept the cabin comfortable through the entire night and well into the next day. He used far less wood than he'd anticipated, maybe 1/8 of what a standard cabin would require. The temperature inside never dropped below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Even when outside temperatures hit -30, he could sleep comfortably, work on projects, read his books, all while the world outside was a frozen death trap. But he also discovered problems. The first winter revealed that moisture was his enemy. His body heat, his breath, cooking, all created water vapor. In the enclosed space, this vapor condensed on the coldest surfaces. Ice formed on the inside of the door. Frost accumulated on the walls near the front. He solved this by improving his ventilation. He cut a second shaft, smaller than the first, that ran from the floor level near his masonry heater up through the roof. This created a circulation system. Cold, fresh air entered through the front vent at ceiling level, warmed as it descended, and stale, warm air exited through the rear vent. The constant air movement eliminated condensation. He also learned that complete burial under snow was actually beneficial, not problematic. The snow acted as additional insulation. Once the cabin was buried, inside temperatures actually stabilized higher. The 12 feet of snow above him created a dead air, space that prevented heat loss. The cabin became a cave, protected by the mountain itself. By spring of 1854, Jacob had spent his first winter in his underground home. He'd used less than 2 cords of firewood. He'd been comfortable, healthy, and mentally sharp. The experiment was a success. Over the next 43 years, Jacob refined his systems into a lifestyle. His annual routine began in late spring, as soon as the snow melted enough to expose his door. Usually, this happened in late May or early June. The first task was always wood. Jacob would spend 6 weeks doing nothing but cutting, splitting, and stacking firewood. He cut only standing deadwood, preferably aspen or pine that had been dead for 2 to 3 years. This wood was dry and seasoned, ready to burn efficiently. He'd cut enough wood for 2 years of heating, not 1. He maintained a constant 2-year supply, using the oldest wood each winter while the newest wood continued to dry. This system ensured he always had perfectly seasoned fuel. He split his wood into uniform pieces, each about 4 inches in diameter and 16 inches long. This size burned hotly and completely in his masonry heater, creating maximum heat with minimum smoke. He stacked his wood in a covered shed he'd built adjacent to his cabin entrance, accessible even when the cabin was buried. Summer was for hunting and preserving meat. Jacob ate almost exclusively meat and fat. He understood, as the mountain men before him had, that fat was fuel in the cold. He hunted elk in the early summer, taking the fattest animals he could find. One large bull elk would provide 500 pounds of meat and 50 pounds of fat. He smoked the meat into jerky, rendering the fat into tallow. He hunted deer, bear, and smaller game. He set snares for rabbits and squirrels. Every animal he took was utilized completely. Meat for food, hides for clothing and insulation, sinew for sewing, bones for tools, organs for immediate eating. By August, his meat supplies would be secured. He'd have 300 to 400 pounds of dried meat and 30 to 40 pounds of rendered fat stored in his root cellar and hung from his rafters. This would sustain him through 8 months of winter. Fall was for maintenance and preparation. Jacob would check his roof, adding more sod if needed, repairing any settling or erosion. He'd inspect his ventilation shafts, ensuring they were clear and functional. He'd re-chink any gaps in his walls, reinforce his door, and check his chimney for cracks. He'd harvest and dry herbs and plants. Not many grew at 10,000 feet elevation, but he knew which ones had value. Yarrow for infections, willow bark for pain, pine needle tea for preventing scurvy. He gathered and dried these carefully, storing them for winter use. By October, he'd be ready. When the first heavy snows came, usually in mid to late October, Jacob would seal himself in. The door wouldn't open again until May. 7 months. Inside a buried cabin. 7 months of isolation, darkness, and cold. But Jacob had learned to thrive in this environment. His daily winter routine was precise and unchanging. Wake at dawn, or what he estimated was dawn. Underground and buried in snow, actual sunlight never reached him. He maintained his sense of time using candle clocks, marked candles that burned at a known rate. He'd light a fire in his masonry heater. The fire would burn hot for 2 hours, heating the stone mass. He'd use this time to cook breakfast, usually fried meat and fat, sometimes mixed with dried berries if he had them. After breakfast, physical exercise. Jacob understood that staying healthy through a 7-month winter required movement. He'd developed a routine of calisthenics, push-ups, squats, stretching exercises, all performed in the limited space of his cabin, 30 minutes every morning, without fail. Mid-morning was for projects. Jacob always had a project. He'd repair clothing, sew new moccasins, craft tools, work on small wood carvings. He'd learn to occupy his hands and mind. Midday was for reading. Jacob had a small library, maybe 20 books, accumulated over decades. He'd read each book dozens of times, but they never lost their value. The Bible, a copy of Shakespeare, a few novels, some practical manuals. He'd read slowly, savoring every word. Afternoon was for more physical work, splitting kindling, organizing supplies, cleaning his living space. Always moving, always active. Evening was for food preparation and a second fire if needed. Usually the masonry heater held enough heat from the morning burn that a second fire wasn't necessary. But on the coldest days, when outside temperatures dropped to minus 49 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, he'd burn a second batch of wood. Night was for rest. Jacob would bank his masonry heater, covering the remaining coals with ash to preserve them for morning. He'd climb into his sleeping platform, wrapped in his hides and blankets, and sleep. The cabin would be silent. No wind, because he was buried under snow. No sounds from outside, because the snow deadened everything, just the occasional creak of timber or the pop of cooling stone. This routine never varied. Day after day, week after week, month after month. The isolation would have driven most men insane. Jacob had learned to embrace it. He'd discovered that the human mind needs surprisingly little external stimulation if given internal work. He had his projects, his books, his exercises, his thoughts. He had the satisfaction of a system that worked, a home that protected him, a life that was entirely under his control. If you're enjoying this deep dive into forgotten survival knowledge, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We're uncovering the lost skills of America's toughest frontiersmen, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. This channel is dedicated to preserving the knowledge that kept people alive before modern technology, and
your subscription helps keep these stories alive. But winter in a buried cabin wasn't without challenges. The psychological toll of total isolation was real. Jacob developed strategies to maintain his mental health. He talked to himself, not rambling or confused, but deliberate conversation. He'd discuss his plans, narrate his actions, argue with himself about decisions. The sound of a human voice, even his own, was important. He maintained a journal, not just recording events, but writing his thoughts and observations. The act of writing, of forming words on paper, kept his mind sharp. He created routines and stuck to them religiously. Routine provided structure when nothing else did. He marked time carefully, tracking days and weeks. Losing track of time was a slippery slope toward losing track of reality. Physical health was another constant concern. Jacob understood that injuries in winter isolation could be fatal. A broken bone, a bad cut, a serious illness, any of these could kill him because help was impossible. He moved carefully, never rushing, always thinking through actions before performing them. He kept himself fit with his daily exercises, maintaining strength and flexibility. He ate his fat-heavy diet, understanding that nutrition was prevention. Fire management was critical. His masonry heater was efficient, but it required proper technique. He learned to build his fires hot and fast. Small pieces of dry wood, arranged to allow maximum airflow, ignited quickly and burned completely. A proper fire produced minimal smoke and maximum heat. Poor fire technique produced smoke that didn't vent properly, creating suffocating conditions. He learned to read his fire, to understand when it needed more air, when it needed more fuel, when it was burning optimally. This wasn't book knowledge. This was skill earned through thousands of fires over decades. Wood management was equally critical. Jacob kept a precise inventory of his fuel supply. He knew exactly how much wood he had and how much he used per day. He rationed carefully, ensuring he never ran short. Running out of wood in February, buried under 12 feet of snow with no way to access his shed, would be a death sentence. He never took chances. Ventilation was something he monitored constantly. His shaft system worked remarkably well, but it could fail. Snow could pack too tightly, blocking airflow. The copper baffle could freeze. The shaft could become ice-choked. Jacob checked his ventilation daily. He'd light a candle and watch how the flame behaved. A steady flame that leaned toward the rear vent meant good airflow. A flickering, dancing flame meant restricted airflow. A flame that struggled to stay lit meant serious problems. He kept tools specifically for clearing his ventilation shafts, long poles that he could push up through the shafts from inside, breaking through ice or packed snow. He'd designed his shafts with this maintenance in mind, making them accessible from inside the cabin. Moisture management remained a challenge throughout every winter. No matter how well he managed his ventilation, some condensation was inevitable. He'd learned to minimize it. He kept his masonry heater at moderate temperatures, not too hot. Extreme heat created more moisture as the differential between inside and outside increased. He dried his clothing completely before storing it. Damp clothing created moisture that would freeze and create ice inside the cabin. He avoided boiling water unnecessarily. Cooking created steam, which created moisture. He ate mostly fried or roasted food, minimizing boiling. He kept the front area of his cabin, nearest the door, slightly cooler than the rest. This cold zone was where any moisture would condense, away from his living and sleeping areas. Spring emergence was always a psychological event. After 7 months underground, seeing sunlight again was almost overwhelming. Jacob learned to manage this transition carefully. He didn't just throw open the door the moment it was accessible. He'd expose himself to light gradually. He'd open his shutters first, letting filtered light enter through his hide window. Then, after a few days, he'd open the door a crack, then wider. Finally, full exposure. The outside world in spring was a shock. Brilliant sunlight reflecting off snow was blinding. The scale of the landscape after months in a 16 by 20 foot space was disorienting. The sound of wind, of running water, of birds was almost painful after so much silence. Jacob had learned to take the transition slowly, giving his body and mind time to readjust. His first days outside were spent on simple tasks, clearing snow from around his door, checking his woodshed, inspecting the exterior of his cabin for winter damage. He'd move slowly, deliberately, reacquainting himself with space and movement. Over 43 years, Jacob refined his system to remarkable efficiency. He added improvements based on what he learned each winter. In year 5, he built a secondary ventilation shaft at the opposite end of the cabin, improving air circulation. In year 8, he enlarged his masonry heater, adding more stone mass and improving heat retention. In year 12, he built a better door, triple layered with a built-in draft seal. In year 15, he added a small skylight, a shaft cut through the roof with a covering of scraped hide. This provided natural light even when buried, as light filtered down through the snow. In year 20, he built a more sophisticated root cellar system with multiple chambers at different depths that maintained different temperatures. In year 25, he upgraded his sleeping platform, adding a framework that supported more insulation beneath him. Every winter taught him something. Every year, his system improved. By year 30, his cabin was as close to perfect as possible for extreme cold living. Jacob kept records throughout his decades in the cabin.
Temperature logs, carefully noted using a mercury thermometer he'd acquired from a trader. He recorded inside and outside temperatures daily, building a database of how his cabin performed. His records showed that when outside temperatures hit -49 degrees Fahrenheit, his cabin maintained an inside temperature of 48 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit with just one fire per day. When outside temperatures were -20 to -30, his cabin stayed at 55 to 60 degrees. In shoulder seasons, when outside temperatures were 0 to 20 degrees, his cabin remained at 60 to 65 degrees. These weren't occasional achievements, these were consistent results, repeated winter after winter, year after year. The mathematics of his efficiency were striking. A standard log cabin at 10,000 feet elevation, in similar conditions, would require burning approximately 8 to 10 cords of wood per winter to maintain barely survivable temperatures. Jacob burned 1.5 to 2 cords per winter and maintained comfortable temperatures. His cabin was 5 to 6 times more efficient than standard construction. This efficiency translated into survival. Less wood needed meant less labor spent cutting and hauling. More time for other essential tasks. Less smoke production meant healthier lungs. Better temperature stability meant better sleep, better health, better mental state. Jacob's lifestyle was sustainable in a way that most mountain cabins were not. He could maintain it indefinitely because it didn't exhaust him or the resources around him. He cut only dead-standing timber, never living trees, allowing the forest to regenerate. He hunted sustainably, never taking more than the valley could replace. He maintained his systems carefully, preventing catastrophic failures. He lived in balance with his environment in a way that modern survivalists often talk about but rarely achieve. But what about the psychological impact of 43 winters of isolation? How did Jacob's mind survive? He'd developed a philosophy, a way of thinking about his life that sustained him. He'd learned to find satisfaction in small things: a well-made fire, a perfectly split piece of kindling, a page of clear writing in his journal, a sharp tool, a comfortable bed. Contentment came from mastery, from understanding his systems so thoroughly that they became extensions of himself. He'd learned to enjoy solitude rather than endure it. The silence of his buried cabin wasn't oppression, it was peace. The isolation wasn't loneliness, it was freedom from the demands and complications of human society. He'd discovered that a man could be alone without being lonely if his life had meaning and purpose. His purpose was simple: survive, maintain his home, perfect his skills, live according to his own terms. This purpose gave structure to his days and meaning to his years. He wasn't waiting for anything. He wasn't working towards some distant goal. He was living fully in each moment, each season, each year. This psychological framework was perhaps his most important survival skill. All the technical knowledge in the world wouldn't have kept him alive through 43 winters if his mind had broken. His mental discipline, his ability to find satisfaction in a harsh, limited existence, was what made his life possible. Jacob aged in his cabin. By the time he was 71, in that winter when he sat reading while buried under 12 feet of snow at -49 degrees Fahrenheit, he'd become something rare. A man who'd successfully aged alone in extreme conditions. His body showed the wear, arthritis in his hands from decades of splitting wood, a slight stoop from years of working in a low-ceiling space, scars from countless small injuries. But he was fundamentally healthy. His diet of meat and fat had sustained him. His daily exercises had kept him mobile. His careful living had prevented serious injury or illness. Jacob continued his pattern through winter after winter. Year 35, year 40, year 42. The system worked as well in year 43 as it had in year 1. Better, actually, because he'd refined every detail. But time catches everyone. In the spring of 1896, Jacob didn't emerge from his cabin. A trapper passing through the valley in June, noticing that smoke had stopped rising from the familiar chimney, dug down to investigate. He found Jacob's body lying peacefully on his sleeping platform, apparently dead in his sleep. He was 91 years old, and he'd spent the last 43 winters of his life in that cabin. The trapper, a young man named Samuel Harding, who'd met Jacob twice before, documented what he found. The cabin was exactly as Jacob had left it. Fire laid, but not lit, in the masonry heater. Tools hung in their places, food supplies still adequate, everything was in order. Jacob had simply not woken one morning. Harding buried Jacob on the hillside above his cabin, in a spot that caught the morning sun. He marked the grave with a cairn of stones. He left the cabin intact, closing the door and walking away. Harding later wrote about the experience in a journal that's now held in the Colorado Historical Society. He described the cabin in detail, marveling at its construction and efficiency. He noted that 43 years of hard use had barely worn it. The logs were still sound, the stonework intact, the systems functional. It could have stood another 43 years. The cabin remained buried and forgotten for decades. The location was remote, the valley rarely traveled. Nature gradually reclaimed the site. The chimney eventually collapsed. The roof settled. Snow and time did their work. It wasn't until 1968 that a hiking party, using Harding's journal as a guide, relocated the site. They excavated carefully, documenting what they found. The structure was still identifiable. The masonry heater, though partially collapsed, showed its ingenious design. The ventilation shafts were still in place. The stone-lined walls were intact. The excavation team included archaeologists and historians who recognized the significance of what they'd found. This wasn't just an old cabin. This was a masterpiece of adaptation, a structure that represented solutions to problems that modern engineers still struggle with. How do you create a comfortable, sustainable living space in extreme cold with minimal resources? Jacob had answered that question through practical experience. The excavation revealed details that Harding's journal hadn't captured. The drainage system under the floor, still functional after a century. The careful layering of different insulation materials in the walls. The precise engineering of the roof structure. The copper baffles in the ventilation shafts, still in place, still able to move. The team documented everything, took measurements, made drawings. Then they carefully reburied the site to preserve it. The location is now protected as a historical site, though its exact coordinates aren't publicly disclosed to prevent damage. Before we wrap up, if you haven't already subscribed, now's the time. Hit that button and join us as we continue exploring the incredible survival techniques of America's pioneers. Every video on this channel uncovers knowledge that's being lost to time, and we need people like you to help preserve it. Don't let these skills disappear. Subscribe now. So what did Jacob Whitmore understand that we've forgotten? He understood that the best way to survive extreme conditions isn't to fight them, but to work with them. He used snow as insulation rather than seeing it as an enemy. He used the earth itself as a thermal battery. He designed with nature, not against it. He understood that efficiency matters more than brute force. His cabin worked because it required minimal input for maximum output. 1 fire per day instead of constant burning. 2 cords of wood instead of 10. Small space instead of large. Every element was optimized for energy efficiency in a way that modern green building is only now rediscovering. He understood that sustainability requires balance. Take only what renews. Use only what's necessary. Waste nothing. Live within your means. These weren't philosophical principles for Jacob, they were survival requirements. He understood that mental strength is as important as physical strength, his psychological discipline, his ability to maintain sanity through decades of isolation, was as crucial as his ability to build a fire or stack wood. He understood that true security comes from knowledge and skill, not from wealth or technology. His cabin was built with an axe, a shovel, and decades of accumulated understanding. No power tools, no modern materials, no backup systems, just knowledge applied through skill. Modern survival experts study Jacob's methods because they represent principles that remain valid. In a world of climate-controlled homes and instant heating, we've lost the understanding of how to maintain warmth efficiently. We heat entire houses to 70 degrees when we only occupy one room. We use thousands of dollars in energy to achieve what Jacob accomplished with 2 cords of wood. His efficiency wasn't just economical, it was ecological. His cabin design incorporated what we now call passive solar heating, thermal mass, super insulation, earth sheltering, and natural ventilation. These are cutting-edge green building concepts. Jacob was using them in 1853. The lesson isn't that we should all go build underground cabins and live alone in the mountains. The lesson is that our ancestors solved difficult problems with remarkable ingenuity, and we've forgotten their solutions in our rush to modern convenience. Jacob Whitmore's 43 years in his snow-buried cabin prove that human beings can thrive in conditions we now consider impossible. He didn't just survive, he lived comfortably. He maintained his health into his 90s. He found satisfaction and meaning in a lifestyle that most people would consider unbearable. His knowledge was paid for through experience. Every winter taught him something. Every mistake, every success, every adjustment refined his understanding. By the end of his life, he'd become a master of his environment in a way that few people ever achieve mastery of anything. The cabin that he built stands, at least conceptually, as a monument to human adaptability. It proves that intelligence, observation, and patience can overcome almost any environmental challenge. It demonstrates that the best technology is sometimes the simplest, the most elegant, the most aligned with natural processes. Today, when we hear about someone surviving in extreme conditions, we imagine them suffering, struggling, barely hanging on. Jacob wasn't suffering. He was living according to his design, in a home he'd created, using systems he'd perfected. He was warm, fed, healthy, and at peace. That's not survival. That's mastery. The specific techniques he used remain relevant. Modern off-grid homesteaders could learn from his ventilation systems, his masonry heater design, his layered insulation approach, his moisture management strategies. The principles behind his success translate across contexts: efficiency over brute force, passive systems over active ones, working with natural processes instead of fighting them, careful observation leading to continuous improvement. Jacob Whitmore spent 43 winters buried under snow at minus 49 degrees Fahrenheit. He did it in comfort, in health, and on his own terms. The cabin he built was more than shelter. It was a statement about what human beings can achieve when they truly understand their environment. It was proof that the harshest conditions can be met not with suffering, but with intelligence and skill. In our modern world of climate control and instant comfort, Jacob's story seems almost mythical. A man living alone for 43 years in a buried cabin at 10,000 feet elevation should not be possible. But Jacob didn't know it was impossible, so he did it anyway. His legacy isn't just a collapsed cabin in a remote valley. His legacy is the knowledge that humans are more capable than we think, more adaptable than we believe, and more able to thrive in harsh conditions than our comfortable lives suggest. When we strip away modern conveniences and rely on pure skill and understanding, we're capable of remarkable things. Jacob Whitmore proved it. 43 winters, 43 years. One man, one cabin, and a mastery of cold that we've forgotten but desperately need to remember. Because the knowledge of how to survive when systems fail, when power goes out, when supply chains break, that knowledge might once again become the difference between life and death. And somewhere under a hillside in Colorado, buried beneath a century of snow and soil and time, Jacob's cabin still holds its lessons. The stone walls still stand. The masonry heater, though collapsed, still shows its design. The ventilation shafts still angle upward toward air that Jacob last breathed in 1896. The cabin is silent now, empty, forgotten by most. But it remains a testament to what one man understood about cold, about survival, and about living in harmony with the harshest environment North America has to offer. Jacob Whitmore built it. He lived in it for 43 years. And in doing so, he taught us something we desperately need to learn. That the old ways weren't primitive, they were sophisticated. That our ancestors weren't merely surviving, they were thriving. And that the knowledge they possessed is worth more than all our modern technology. When the cold comes calling, the mountain remembers. The snow still falls. And Jacob's cabin, though buried and broken, still whispers its secrets to anyone willing to listen. The question is, are we listening, or have we forgotten how?